Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Josie Pickens, and I'm the Program Director of upEND Movement. upEND is a part of a national movement dedicated to abolishing the family policing system, which most know as the child welfare system. We are so excited to host our first hybrid event tonight with Roxanna, Devontae, Hannah, and Marcus, but also interrogates how incredibly harmful the family policing system can be towards Black families, how the system defines, through a problematic lens, what family means, and even what neglect and abuse means, and even more, the work we need to do as a society to create communities of care that keep families together instead of separating them. We Were Once a Family hits close to home for the upEND team, as the children who were murdered called Houston home before they were taken from their families and communities and pushed into the foster and adoption systems that many believe are partially responsible for their deaths. After Roxanna shares a passage from We Were Once a Family, she'll join Professor Alan Detlef for a conversation about the book, the family policing system, and why this system, as it currently operates, must be dismantled. Here's a bit about Roxanna and Alan. Roxanna Asgarian is a Texas-based journalist who writes about courts and the law for the Texas Tribune. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, New York Times, and Texas Monthly, among other publications. She received the 2022 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award for We Were Once a Family. Alan Detlef is a professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, where he also served as dean from 2015 to 2022. Alan began his career as a social worker in the family policing system, where he worked as an investigative caseworker and administrator. Today, his work focuses on ending the harm that results from this system. In 2020, he helped to create and launch the upEND Movement, a collaborative effort dedicated to abolishing the family policing system and building alternatives that focus on healing and liberation. Alan received his bachelor's degree in social work from TCU and master's and PhD in social work from the University of Texas at Arlington. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System, The Case for Abolition, to be published by Oxford University Press in 2023. He is also co-founding editor of Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work, a peer-reviewed scholarly journal dedicated to developing and disseminating an abolitionist praxis in social work. Let's welcome Roxanna to the stage.
Thank you all for coming. Just gonna start. At 15 years old, just 3 years after her mother's murder, Sherry became mother to a son, DeMarcus. Her second son, DeAndre, came shortly after. She dropped out of high school and took up with an abusive boyfriend who controlled her movements. She left DeMarcus and DeAndre with a friend, and after the friend didn't hear from her for a couple weeks, they called CPS. Sherry said her boyfriend had kidnapped her and wouldn't let her leave his house. She lost the boys, who were adopted out of foster care. Sherry was pregnant with her third son when she reconnected with Nathaniel Davis. She'd known him for most of her life. He went by Joe Boy, and he grew up across the street from her mom and aunts back in the day. He was much older. When they reconnected, Sherry was 19 and Nathaniel was 47. He had been married and divorced and had grown children. He was steady, though. He did yard work and was staying with his mom while he got his disability benefits together. And once he did that, he was going to get a place of his own.
Sherry moved into that place with him, along with her new son, baby DeQuince. The nature of their relationship was unusual. Nathaniel never fathered any of Sherry's children. He did raise and nurture them all, though. He knew that he hadn't done it right with his own kids the first time. He wasn't around enough for them, and his one grown biological son wouldn't talk to him because of it. And he wanted to do right by Sherry's children. He wanted to be a good father. When DeQuince was 3 months old, his biological dad stopped by and asked Nathaniel if he could take him out. When he returned, DeQuince's arm was sore and swollen. His biological father told Sherry he'd fallen out of his stroller at the park. But when Nathaniel took him to Ben Taub, the public hospital downtown, they told him DeQuince had multiple broken bones. Crazed, Sherry came to the hospital and took DeQuince home, terrified that CPS workers would take him as they had taken her other children. And, of course, they did. Nathaniel wanted to fight CPS to get DeQuince back, but Sherry wouldn't do it. Instead, she began to use more crack cocaine, tipping her cigarettes with the white powder before smoking them. Shortly after, DeQuince went to live with a woman in Sunnyside, another poor Black Houston neighborhood. He was adopted too. When Dante was born to a man Sherry was not in a serious relationship with, she gave the newborn Nathaniel's last name, Davis, and the family left the 4th Ward and settled down near Sunnyside. Sherry worked as a home health aide, leaving for several days at a time to stay in the home of the elderly patients she cared for, and she prided herself on not needing welfare checks to get by. Dante was 5 years old when Devante was born, and Dante loved being a big brother. Nathaniel would cook for the boys and clean up after them, and take Devante to the hospital when his asthma got bad. By all accounts, Sherry loved her kids. She kept her boys fed and clothed in fresh new sneakers, but she still had her cocaine habit. She'd get stressed and reach for her pack of cigarettes, slap them against her hand to pack them down, and sprinkle the white powder in the space left at the top. Lighting her primos, as she called them, made her feel good and helped her forget about the drama of the day. Sherry took up with the new man, Clarence, but the kids stayed with Nathaniel, whom they considered their father. Nathaniel told people he and Sherry were still together, and they were, in a way. Whenever she came to stay, she cooked for her children and cleaned up around the house, and he raised the children when she was out. She'd stay out for days, sometimes for her job, but other times for other reasons. When Jeremiah was born in 2004, Sherry and the baby tested positive for cocaine, and Nathaniel got custody of the children, which really just solidified the relationship they already had in place. The boys got a bunk bed, and Jeremiah's new crib was rolled in. Nathaniel's grown daughter, Carmenelle, came most days to help with the baby, and the boys slept in Nathaniel's bed, all piled in together, while the new bunk bed sat empty in the boys' room. Dante, Devante, and baby Jeremiah were Nathaniel's whole life, and he told the CPS caseworker that if he had to choose between Sherry and the children, he'd keep his kids in a heartbeat. The situation was stable but still tenuous, with the threat of removal always hanging over the family. Because of Sherry's history with the agency, and especially because of the abuse of DeQuince, caseworkers kept a close eye on the Davis family. In 2005, Sherry gave birth to a baby girl she named Sierra. Sherry was still with Clarence Celestine, who was also Jeremiah's father. In the hospital, Sherry again tested positive for cocaine, although the baby tested negative. She pleaded with the caseworkers, asking them to give her another chance. But her child welfare case was moved from the reunification track to the termination track, and the kids were taken from Nathaniel's house, in part because he told them he didn't know Sherry was using again. He had meant that she was never high around the kids, which is when he spent time with her. But they had seen his response as enabling her drug use.
just want to do a couple of things. For those of you who may not already be doing so, I'd like you to follow upEND Movement on our social media pages, on Twitter and Instagram, at upEND Movement. We'd love for you to subscribe to our newsletter. You can find that way of subscribing on our website, which is upendmovement.org. Also, when we think about events like these, I think it's important to mention that our goal is to always keep events like these free and open to everyone. Our initiative is funded entirely through grants and donations, and we really hope that you will consider donating to upEND Movement. You can do that by also going to our website, upendmovement.org/donate. So now for the conversation between Alan and Roxanna.
Thank you, Roxanna, and thank you for everybody who's here today. Thank you for everyone who's watching us online. I really like that we started with that part of the book because it sets up the idea that, or the premise that this is a book not just about a family, but also about a system that they had many engagements with. And I want to shift, that is a section from the first chapter of the book. I want to read to you a couple sentences from the epilogue that I think follow up on that really well, and then get your reaction to that. In the epilogue you write, "The Hart family story complicates popular narratives about abuse and the role of CPS in protecting children from it. The children's birth families were not beating their children or starving them. They were clearly struggling with substance use and mental illness. But instead of receiving help, the parents were punished." We probably have a lot of people watching this that may be unfamiliar with the child welfare system or child protective services, that think that the system is set up to help families and provide them, and parents and children, with the help they need, and may be surprised to see that you write that this is a system that rather than help them, punish them. How did you come to understand that about the system?
I think that started in the first couple stories that I ever wrote about the child welfare system. This was back in 2016, and I started by writing about the decades-old, at this point, lawsuit against Texas for its abysmal treatment of kids in long-term care. Through that process, I started by, there was a plaintiff in that case, and she shared her foster care file with me, and I couldn't help but realize just how bleak and tragic her life and her childhood had been. Largely, her childhood was in the system. So she says she has spent decades in the system, and she experienced all types of abuse while she was in foster care. And through that process, I realized, foster care is a really dangerous place for kids. And when I started reporting on this story, I had that background. And so, this story made so much more clear how punitive and how harmful the interactions that all the families had with the system really were. It also set up this disparity between how the adoptive family was treated and how the birth families were treated. That was just so stark that you couldn't ignore it.
I think, one of the things that I think when people first hear about this book, pick it up, again, think it's going to be the story of a family. And in so many ways, it's so much more than that. What I think is different about the reporting that you did is that in a lot of ways, this isn't what people might expect as a true crime story that's talking about abuse in this family. But I think, to me, as I read it, the most chilling part of your reporting is really more about how the state can be so cruel under the guise of benevolence. You mentioned the word punitive. Were you able to uncover, where does that come from? Where does the cruelty, where does the punitive nature come from? And how does a system that's supposed to be designed to help turn into that?
That's a good question. I think in my reporting, I realized that the foundation of the child welfare system is punitive and racist. You know, going all the way back to Indian residential schools for Native American children, the orphan trains, where they sent kids from slums of New York City to farmlands to basically be, you know, manual labor for people. You know, these are some of the earliest iterations of what we consider the child welfare system now. And I think through that process of really uncovering the history, it became so clear. You can see the through line through all of it. You know, it was started by benevolent seeming white ladies. There was a big church component to the child welfare system early on. And we've seen the sort of problematic nature of these sort of white savior, benevolent white women thing. And in this story, you can see that that's exactly sort of where these kids ended up with people like that.
Related to that, I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear about the racism in the system, and that in many ways the system has been racist from its earliest origins, or may understand that there was racism in the early origins of the system, that there likely were in many systems, but would be surprised to hear about racism in the system today. Can you talk about ways that you saw racism manifest in the system?
Yes, I think that there's tons of research on the disproportionality of who gets targeted by CPS. Disproportionately Black people, poor people, people who are, it's exclusively people who are marginalized already in other ways, whether it be immigration status or disability or being LGBTQ. So, you know, essentially, abuse and neglect does happen. It happens across the board, but we only see CPS targeting already marginalized populations. It's also really clear that there's no actual support provided. So, you know, in the case of the Davis family, that's 3 of the kids. So 6 kids, 3 from each sibling group, 2 sibling groups. You know, with the Davis family, they were treated, they were living with their aunt, and the aunt made a decision because she lacked childcare to allow her, to allow their birth mom to watch them. And a caseworker stopped by and immediately removed the kids, and they never lived with their family again over that. So, you know, you could see a need for childcare. And you could see the response, which is removing children from a place where they could all be together. You know, one kid at that point, Dante, the oldest, he never, he entered foster care for years and years after that, where he wasn't allowed to see any of his family members. So it's like the approach was punitive, not only towards the parents and the adults in the family, but it also ended up being really harmful to the children themselves.
Right. I know I'm going off script with this next one, but I know you can handle it. But you mentioned, I think again, a lot of people would be surprised to hear that the system doesn't actually provide help to the families in the way that they need help. I'm sorry, can y'all bring me a water? Thanks. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like the way the system responds is not what parents actually need. Thanks, Josie.
Yeah.
Where does that mentality come from, that it's not based on actually addressing people's needs, but is more based on a punitive response?
Well, it's really interesting because I think, like you said, I think a lot of people would assume that CPS could provide some level of support, you know, because the reasons, especially with neglect, which the vast majority of child protective cases are about neglect and not abuse. And these neglect cases often come around because of things like housing instability or food.
Childcare.
Yeah,
like
childcare is a huge thing. And as we know, like in our country, childcare is a huge issue for people who are in the middle class and are otherwise stable. Like this is a major issue. So for people who are dealing with poverty, it's very clear that their needs are very material, but we don't provide that material support. It's just not a function of what the child welfare system provides. And I think that's pretty, you know, when you're talking about like when I started realizing that the system is harmful and not benevolent, I mean, that's a really good example of that, right? Like, you know,
parents need childcare, provide them childcare.
Right, and to understand that, you know, their aunt Priscilla, she needed to keep her job. She had a stable job. She was full-time. She got 4 additional children into her home. And so, and at that point, they weren't getting, kinship care didn't get monthly payments at all during this time. Right. They got a one-time payment of like $1,000 plus a few hundred per child. So, you know, she had to buy 4 beds. She had to buy, you know, one of them was in diapers. Like, she had to keep her job. So the idea of like running up against a lack of childcare and this being such a solvable problem.
Right.
And also the idea that like any contact with their mom is so de facto harmful, which, you know, I don't think really was the case. I know she had, you know, drug abuse issues, and I think that she was still able to like see and love her kids, you know?
Totally. I'm gonna read one of your tweets. You tweeted, "It might be an outlier in its tragic outcome, but what happened to the birth families happens all the time. The approach toward birth families is punitive. The approach toward adoptive parents is to give the benefit of the doubt. The examples are plentiful. Like other stories that you've covered or that you know about in the system? And how is it similar in the sense that people understand, although there are very unique cases and certainly a very tragic outcome, this is happening to people all around us all the time, particularly in the differences in between how birth families and adoptive families or potential adoptive families are treated?"
Yeah, I think, you know, what really drew me to this story as like a book-length project was how it really hit on so many issues that are extremely common in the child welfare system, because it involved multiple families and they lived in different states, right? Because there's a patchwork system, as you know. It basically showcased, you know, because the idea that this is an outlier is something I've come up against a lot when people are interacting with this work. I think some people really want it to be a very tragic, like, individual story. And it is a very tragic individual story. I mean, it is. And so, you know, but what frustrated me about the coverage of the case as I was reporting this is that in so many ways, it's a run-of-the-mill story. When you look at the system and the approach that they took with the birth families, again, that's common, that's quite common. Again, they don't offer support. They offer, they actually force a laundry list of compliance, you know, things that you have, hoops that you have to jump through and things that you have to complete perfectly, and they give you no support to do so. And then when it comes to the adoptive family, it was just extremely clear that the treatment was, I mean, it was, you know, the kids were presenting in their adoptive homes with bruises. They were malnourished. Teachers had repeatedly pointed out that that the kids didn't seem like they had enough to eat, and that they were trying to, you know, like looking in trash cans and things like that. And the mothers, you know, there was an allegation of abuse made before the second set of siblings were adopted. So this is a moment where, because there's another sort of line of thinking that, oh, they must have been really overwhelmed. And you heard that a lot. And you heard it a lot during the inquests and in the coverage. And I think that, you know, there were signs really early, and no one was looking for those signs. And no one, when they were faced with them, they were being ignored. And I feel like that shows such a stark difference, because they just assumed that these white ladies were taking better care of these kids than their families, their original families were.
How much of that do you think is whiteness and how much do you think is perceptions that we have about adoptive families generally?
That's a good question. I think both contributed. I think that Jennifer Hart specifically was very vocal in a way that was legible to caseworkers. So she could talk about the kids' trauma histories, and she could talk about their vegetarian lifestyle. And at one point they started homeschooling the kids. This was after Sarah Hart pled guilty to domestic abuse and had to serve probation. They pulled their kids out of public school because that was that's how the complaint was originated. So, but it was like spun in this way of being so progressive and so wholesome and growing chickens and that kind of thing. And I feel like caseworkers saw that and heard that language, and it felt to them like good parenting.
Right.
And I think that, like, in the case of like Nathaniel Davis, who was the father figure, because he wasn't a biological father, like, that was not legible. They were like, who's this man? And even though he was providing good, stable care and, ultimately was around until like his dying day for these kids, that was not legible to caseworkers in the same way.
Right. Did your experience in investigating this family, I think how to ask this. I'm wondering your thoughts about foster to adopt policies, which for people who are watching that don't understand means that someone can be licensed to foster and adopt at the same time. And often people who come in to foster do so specifically for the motivation of adopting. And often then there can be motivations within the system to streamline that towards adoption.
Yes.
So then you have people going into the system not because they want to be foster parents as a temporary caregiver and then hope that those children are returned, but for the purpose of hoping those children's parental rights are terminated and they get to keep them permanently. Was that an issue at all in this case, the adoption motivation, and what's your thoughts generally about that foster to adopt idea?
Yeah, it was for sure an element of this case. Jen and Sarah specifically wanted to adopt, and that's what they actually originally fostered a kid in Minnesota, and it was a temporary situation because her mom's rights weren't terminated. She needed, essentially what fostering is meant to be, where you need a safe place because your parent isn't able to provide you that at that moment, and they clearly sought out all 6 of the kids from Texas from the Adoption Resource Exchange website for that reason. And I think when they brought the first 3 kids home, they just gave the foster kid away. But they didn't tell her. Actually, they dropped her off at her therapy appointment, and the therapist told her and said, oh, by the way, you're all packed up, and you won't see them again. And that's how she thought for years, like, what did I do? So so it was really clearly an element of this, is they were using this girl as a stepstone to be able to adopt. And, in the system, it sets up this conflict of interest because ultimately the goal is supposed to be reunification. But you're setting up people, a whole, you're setting up the hopes of people, like explicitly by saying you can do this to be an adoptive parent. So you're pitting them against the birth parents. And if the birth parents and the adoptive or prospective adoptive parents go head to head, it's very clear if you're just watching these court cases unfold. Every single time the prospective adoptive parents are given preference. And even when we talk about the kinship payments, right? It's like kinship payments are less than foster payments. That's de facto setting up a preference.
Absolutely. Because if the system were working the way it's supposed to work, where foster care is a temporary solution, then foster parents should be on the same team with the agency, where everybody together is working to get the children back reunited in their homes.
Yeah, and the foster parents should be on the same team as the birth parents.
Right.
Because, birth parents are often struggling, and foster parents can actually play a supportive role in that. Like, okay, so, bringing them to visit so they can spend good quality time and keep the connection strong. And like, if you have a potential adoptive parent in that situation, they're often threatened by the connection that birth kids have with their parents.
Yeah, so it's almost like it sets them up, for the birth parents up for failure from the beginning, because you have foster parents who are adoption motivated. You have an agency that in many ways is prefers adoption motivated. Adoption motivated, and often prefers the adoptive family for issues related to, say, class, race, all of those things. So the birth family has little support to start with, not even the people who are temporarily taking care of their children.
Yeah, I mean, it's, and again, like, this story really showcased all the things that are very common, but it's just, in the specifics of the case, it's so stark and so blatant, that it's like, and because the adoptive parents are white and because the kids are black, it shows that the racism that they experienced is not just a systemic disproportionality that we talk about, like, as if there's who knows how this is, why this is. It's like, it ends up being, like in academia when we talk about this stuff, it ends up being like this, there's no one to be held accountable for that behavior. But in this case, it's very clear that it's not just like a systemic disproportionality, it's actual racism.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings us to the Adoption and Safe Families Act. The Adoption and Safe Families Act essentially is the policy, the federal policy, that allows the state to terminate parental rights and move a child forward towards adoption, often when they're in these foster to adoptive homes. Currently, the law says that if a child is in foster care for 15 out of the last 22 months, then that child has to be moved forward to some type of permanency, and if parents aren't ready to have the child reunited, then they move towards termination of parental rights. There is a movement nationally to repeal the Adoption and Safe Families Act because of how quickly it expedites adoption cases. But there's a counter to that, where some people want to reform ASFA. There's currently a bill under consideration sponsored by Karen Bass, current mayor of Los Angeles, former senator, who wants to extend the timelines of ASFA to, rather than 15 months, change them to, if a child is in care for 24 months, then the rights will be terminated after 24 months. So I'll make this a two-part question. What did the constraints of ASFA have to do with this family? And in this case, would extending that deadline from 15 months to 24 months have made any difference?
So in Texas, CPS files for termination like upon removal, and they do that just extra, like above and beyond.
Just as an immediate backup.
Yeah, it's a backup plan. So the idea is they file for, like, there's a reunification track, but then there's also a termination track. And this is to make sure it's happening as soon as possible. So if we realize that reunification isn't possible, you've already got the paperwork all ready to go. So
it kind of really says something about the agency, does it? That they're automatically operating on the assumption that this probably won't work out.
Yes, and I do think that birth families are set up in the system to fail. The laundry lists, like I was telling you, the service plans. If you don't complete every single item of your service plan, that is a ground for termination. And that's, they're almost impossible to complete. Like, I had a former judge tell me, like, there's a way to terminate rights in basically every case, like legally. And then, so I don't think that the 24 months or 15 months is really the crucial issue, because I feel like if we, ASFA in effect, what it did was give preference to adoptive placements. They said permanent placements, but again, we're putting parents on a timeline, and it's parents who are dealing with stuff like drug abuse, and that's difficult. That's a difficult problem.
15 months.
Yeah, it's not like, okay, I can just, it's very tough. And I think what it ends up doing is,
We're back. Thanks. Sorry for everybody watching for the momentary interruption. I forgot where we were.
We were talking about ASPA. So I think what I was saying was...
And you were talking about the complicated problems that families are dealing with that aren't necessarily a 15-month versus a 24-month issue.
Right. And also, another element to ASFA is kids are getting their rights to their parents terminated without having an adoptive family waiting for them, because you have to do it if it hits this timeline. So what you're ending up doing is severing ties that kids have to family members who want to be their parents without providing them any other stable, loving option. So Dante Davis, the oldest brother in the Davis family, that was his experience. His rights were terminated, and he was in an institution for years, and he wasn't allowed to see any of his family members. Like they weren't allowed to visit or send him gifts.
They're not even family members legally.
Yeah,
anymore.
they were considered strangers to him. But in his life, his family really mattered to him, and he wasn't even able to have like any limited contact with them at all.
Wow. I think that's such an important point that I don't think people realize about ASFA. If you're on the surface, it could seem helpful to children because people will say you don't want kids languishing in foster care. That's why there's these deadlines, or that's what the state or the system will tell you. But the point that you made is really good. It's not like there's a plan for those children waiting in the wings. It's not like rights are terminated and there's an adoptive family in many cases waiting. Often the rights are terminated and then children stay in foster care, or they stay in an institution for years upon years, and it just shuts down the entire process of the family having any chance to regain custody of their children.
Right, and it's the definition of languishing in foster care.
Absolutely.
Because it's the most it's not a place to have a childhood, to grow up in an institution with staff members. That's not something that really any kid should have to live with.
Right. I heard someone else call it legal orphans. That ASFA creates tens of thousands of legal orphans every
I think
year.
it's exactly that, yeah. And I think those institutions are essentially orphanages. We don't call them that. We call them treatment centers. But they're almost completely. They are virtually full of foster youth in this situation. Older foster youth who aren't being placed in. It's like, for those kids, how is that better?
Right.
How is that better than even a problematic home life?
Because they have parents
Right.
who want them and love them,
Right.
and their rights are completely legally severed forever, with no opportunity to reverse them.
Yeah, it's a bad law.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible. But thanks for pointing that out, because I think people don't realize it doesn't get kids into permanency faster. It literally just sets more children up to languish in foster care for even longer. I want to switch a little bit to some of the financial implications that are touched on in the book. And again, another thing that I think people probably don't think about much, about the billion-dollar industry that is foster care and adoption. But that to me was one of the through lines that came through the book, really, like the business of family policing. For example, we've had many conversations about how foster parents are literally given money to take care of strangers' children, when in many cases, all those children's parents need is money. But instead of giving money to the parents who need it, money's given to strangers to take care of other people's children. And then there's the troubled teen industry, which Dante experienced and takes in $1.2 billion annually, even as it pays staff sometimes maybe $10 an hour to work in those facilities. Can you talk about ways that you learned about how money drives decisions in this industry, or the business of family policing?
Yeah. You know, I think, for instance, there's tiered levels of care. There's a basic rate. So that's the other thing, like, you know, it's like the more behavioral needs that a kid expresses, the higher their level of care is, and the more money people get for taking them in. And then you end up at these institutional settings, which essentially are like advocating for these rates to be increased and increased and increased. I think there's something in the legislature this year about increased rates for placements. And ultimately, you know, again, those places are paying kids like young 20-somethings $10 an hour to essentially do a job that requires like an extreme, I mean, you're putting a bunch of traumatized teenagers essentially in one place and then hiring like a 22-year-old minimum wage to watch them. I mean, you know, it's a recipe for abuse. And people are making money though, with the money, you know. I think the other piece is like there's an intergenerational aspect to foster care. There's also a foster care to prison pipeline. And I think both of those things essentially continue to feed the beast of, you know, the industry. I think that in so many ways the incarceration and foster care Venn diagram is like a circle. There's so much overlap there. And so I feel like the things that we're doing to kids affects them so deeply. Like especially when you institutionalize kids, you're setting them up essentially to have a life of being incarcerated.
Right, and what's so twisted about the system and the levels of care is that the system benefits the more they traumatize children. So if a child comes in at what they call a level 1 or level 2, which is minimal behaviors, you then forcibly separate them from their family, make them live in a home of a stranger, or put them in an institution, they're going to start acting out. And then in a few months, their level's going to go up. So there's a financial benefit to the system by inflicting trauma on children.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the system views it that way, but the trauma that children experience while they're in care is caused by the system.
Yeah.
And then they financially benefit from it.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out that we talk about resiliency and the ways that kids can be resilient. And I think when you take kids not just from their parents, but from their families and their friends and their schools and their community and their favorite teacher, which is what happens when kids go into foster care, you're taking away their ability to be resilient because you're essentially isolating them completely. And, you know, we're claiming to protect these kids, but, and, you know, even in the cases of the worst harm, right? Removing kids away from all of the people that they know is a really mean and harmful thing to do to a kid. And so these behaviors, you know, like Dante's behaviors that put him on this track at a young age, he essentially was on this track at 10 years old. Wow. And he's currently incarcerated again now. And he's profoundly impacted by his childhood. And he's really unable to trust. And this was inflicted systematically onto him. Like, you know, in his case file, you read entry after entry that's talking about Dante asking about his siblings and when can he have a phone call with them? Can he do a home visit? Can you ask the adoptive parents if we can be in contact, if I can write him a letter, you know? And it was like, they're simultaneously telling him that his behaviors are bad, and if he wants to get adopted, he needs to have better behavior. And then they're like turning around and saying, I think you just have to let it go. You're not gonna see these kids anymore, but just they'll live in your hearts. Like that's the nicest thing that anyone ever told him about what was happening.
That's horrible. And then you have the adoptive parents who probably don't want him to be in touch.
Yeah, they said no.
Right, because he's not part of the adoption package that they're
Right.
hoping to get.
Well, and he's a link to another history that they didn't want to tell. You know, the history that they were telling about the family life of the kids in their birth families was like that they were horrifically abused, that they only knew cuss words, that they were shooting guns when they were 4 years old. It was just blatant lies and racist lies that everyone ate right up. Like, you know, so that's the other piece of it too, is like, it's not just the system, but it's this general idea of like the benevolence of adoptive parents and the stigma of people who are involved with CPS, that you assume that they're bad parents, that you assume that they don't love their children, you know, that you assume that they physically harm them, when the reality is so much different than that.
Right. I think that's really important. I want to shift a little bit to hopefully come to some potential solutions in a hopeful place. I know before this book you've been reporting on family policing for years, and in this book I think very cleverly you bring up the idea of abolition of the system. After establishing firmly how horrific the system is, you bring up the idea of abolition towards the end in the epilogue. As someone who's been reporting on this agency for years and probably reported on reform efforts and understands reform efforts, how have you come to understand the abolition movement? And specifically how reforms, which many people advocate for, may not be enough, given what you know about the system now?
I think that, you know, my path towards understanding abolition generally, and specifically the idea of these non-reformist reforms, like that really helped me understand ways that we can shift towards, you know, more protections, I guess, more legal protections for families. Like, you know, essentially the idea of reform is ever present in the child welfare system. We're constantly reforming it, right? It's like this, it's this thing that is almost like a meaningless term, because what they're asking for is money, right? How many times have you heard people say they're overworked and underfunded, you know, overburdened system? We hear that all the time, but we never talk about all of the kids that are removed that shouldn't be removed. So like, when we talk about non-reformist reforms, which is essentially reforms that are outside of the system or that are doing it with the goal of shrinking the system and not growing it. You can see like supportive okay, so like the obvious thing that we think, you know, CPS might provide support, but they don't, like that's a beautiful place to put some efforts, right?
Like childcare.
Childcare, like the child tax credit. You know, there's like research about how the child tax credit reduced abuse and neglect, took millions of kids out of poverty, like made a huge, meaningful, impactful difference in poor families' lives.
Right.
We took that away. That's a beautiful non-reformist reform, because it's outside of the system and it like seeks to do what the system claims to want to do, which is protect kids, but without the punishment part of it.
It actually addresses material needs of
Right,
families.
and I think once I started thinking about things in that way, it opened up a lot of solutions that when we just talk about reforms and the overburdened and the, you know, like the foster payment should be increased. Like, should they? Like, that's a good place to start. It's like, you know, yes, we do need to put money into protecting families. Like, but there's ways to do it that is divorced from this system that's really traumatizing, not just for the parents, but for the children, primarily for the children.
Right. I think, you know, when we talk about abolition, people often focus on the ending or the tearing down of the system, just abolishing the system, and then think that that means children will be unsafe, unprotected. But this will be the last question, so you know if you want to put anything in there.
Okay.
Because then we're going to get to some audience questions and online questions. But Ruth Wilson Gilmore often says that abolition is presence, not absence. That abolition is so much more about the building new things than it is about the tearing down. When you think about everything you know about this family, all of the intimate details that you know about them, what would a world look like, or a society look like, where the family had the challenges they were facing, but that the idea of forcibly separating them by the government would not have been an intervention that anyone would have thought of, because the idea would be of taking people's children would be so repellent. What would a society look like where that's not the go-to? But there's what would have kept the family together if we lived in that society?
I think that's a beautiful question. I think a society in which we have a functional safety net. I think that, there's a through line of trauma in all of these families that are kind of, the family here is actually several families that are all kind of joined in various ways. I think we as a society do not support families generally. So I was talking about childcare before, because that's an issue across the board that everyone struggles with, unless you are a rich person, you struggle with childcare. I think that what we see, like I said, that the families that are involved with CPS are already marginalized. These are the people that are already struggling against all of this, all of the inhumanity of our systems, our lack of Medicaid expansion. That's a very specific but obvious example, right? There's ways that, drug treatment, the fact that, poor people should be able to access drug treatment.
Accessible, free drug treatment.
And non-coercive mental health care, because I think, another thing that came up in this book was all the ways that therapy was weaponized against people who really did need mental health care, but it was done in a coercive way, or they were made to do it. And so then now they can't get anything there because they don't have that trust there. They've had that trust violated, Right. So it's there are problems, and there's harm, and there's people who have been really wounded, right? But the ways that the focus on punishment takes over every speck of imagination that we might use to at the very, very minimum, just giving people money. Just giving people money.
Sounds so simple.
Yeah, we know, we actually, the wild thing about the child tax credit is people studied it as it was happening, and it was oh my God, we saw it really was immeasurable. The fact that we let that go just shows we're really committed to a system of punishment across the board, and we have a lack of care for all families, but especially for poor families.
Right. And I lied. I have one more question.
Okay.
Because we're a college of social work, and I know we have many of our students watching, we often have students that get into social work because they want to help children. And they want to help children who in many cases are experiencing some form of maltreatment.
Yeah.
What would you say to social workers who get into social work because they want to help children?
Yeah.
What path should they pursue?
Well, I think that's really wonderful thing about what y'all do here is it provides a training ground for people who want to, because look, people get into social work largely to help people. I believe that, I think that CPS is a traumatized system, and so people in it become traumatized by what they're seeing and witnessing, and also by the lack of power that they have to actually make any change. and the like repeated bureaucracy that they run up against that is unethical. And I think that burns people out really quickly, and we see the turnover. I also think it, the people who do stay become really hardened in a way that it's hard to do good work and to help kids when you are hardened to suffering.
Well, that's a really good way to say it.
You know, I think it's really hard to stay open to suffering. And I think that people who get in this profession and want to do it and to witness and, you know, because like the witnessing and the supporting is huge for people. And in this book I found, like, I'm not a social worker, I'm a journalist. It felt like just the act of witnessing people who had been made invisible in the narrative there was some healing there for them, and like non-judgmental support. So like, you know, my hope would be that we start creating pathways, employment pathways that are focused on non-punitive support. And I do think that they exist and that they're, you know, growing. And I feel like expanding the idea of what you might think a social worker can do or where they can be, like places that they can be, I think is a good start. But I think for the young CPS caseworkers, I feel really for them. You know, I think it's not a good job. It's a hard job, and it's like it's that traumatized system piece where it's like that is deeply it's like betrayal, you know, because what you're trying to do is help and what you're made to do is harm.
It's harm. Wow, that's a really good way to say it. I so enjoy talking with you, Roxanna, about all of this. And I know we've been talking to a while, and I know we probably have some audience and online questions. So let's open it up to the group that we have here and online. Josie, are you moderating that part?
I think so.
Okay, awesome.
And I think I have to use your mic.
You could take the mic, because the questions will be for Roxanna.
All right, so we have a few questions. We have some questions online. We have some folks here. If you'd like to ask Roxanna a question, please raise your hand and I'll come around. But we can begin with this. Insane.
Oh my gosh. It is, right? That's a great question. I haven't gotten that one yet. It was I actually ended up like asking a lawyer with like Social Security, like as their expertise, because what happened was Nathaniel got disability, and so two of the kids got disability payments for Nathaniel. And they continued to get that, meaning the Hart women continued to get those payments until the kid's death. Wow. And when Nathaniel found that out, it really enraged him, as you could imagine. Like, Nathaniel, again, was, and I don't think I told everyone in this room, but Dante, when he was 16, he ended up reuniting with Nathaniel, and Nathaniel got legal custody of him. So he held out, you know, and it also stands to, like, it raises the question that if he was a fit parent when he was 16, why couldn't he have been a fit parent when he was 10 and before he had been traumatized for 6 years in an institution? So Nathaniel never gave up. He always wanted to find the kids. When he heard about their murders, it was obviously devastating to him. And then they found in the Hart women's home documents that show that he was giving his disability payments to them this whole time. And ultimately, that isn't illegal. That's what the lawyer ended up, like, we kind of drilled down on, is like, because this is extremely unethical, it seems like, at the very least. I think that in some cases, like if Nathaniel were to pass away or something, the benefits would continue until 18. And so in some ways that makes sense, right? Like, so you're providing money. In theory, you don't want to cut that if you can keep it going, right? But in this situation, it was such a stark, I mean, you know, he couldn't speak to or know anything about them or communicate with them at all, but the money was still going to them.
Yes, but speaking of Dante, so many people online are commenting about how their hearts are just going out to Dante. One question, how are Dante and his son doing now? Do you know anything?
So in the book, I talk about Ye, which is Dante's son, who got removed by CPS as well. So this happened in the course of while I was reporting on the family. And I covered that case, each hearing and all of that, and ultimately Dante and his girlfriend's parental rights were terminated. So Ye is in a prospective adoptive home. Dante is incarcerated again, so they're not doing great.
And has Sherry been able to locate her other two sons?
Not yet, as far as I know. It's a desire that she has. They are old enough now where it's possible that they might be in touch. She is in touch with DeQuinn, so that's cool. So one of the three of her older sons, they because he was adopted in their neighborhood, essentially. You know, they never like they had never lost, like totally severed their connection.
You write about the media's reporting of child maltreatment. What needs to happen to change the type of reporting done by journalists so that it is done with a systematic analysis?
That's a great question. I think part of it is that we have to make child welfare reporting a beat. So it's kind of weird that it's not a beat. A beat is, you know, something like, if I write about the criminal legal system, that's all I write about. I get really good at it. I go, you know, deep into it. I have all my sources and stuff. And essentially that was my beat as a freelancer. But there's really no major outlets that have, I mean, very few. I think there's a couple ProPublica reporters that have that as a beat. But it touches so many different aspects of big major stories. So like the family separations at the border, like that was a child welfare story. And I actually had a bunch of immigration reporters reaching out to me. We're trying to sort of, because it's where two systems bump up against each other. I think we need to pay for a child welfare reporter in outlets. I think that's like a very, like a no-brainer. I think once you can let someone, because what ends up happening is you get a lot of really smart young reporters who come in and do a couple stories about like the foster care lawsuit or something, and then they get moved on to somewhere else. And it's like, it's a general assignment, you know, reporter's job right now. And so you're not getting specialized people. It's a tough and a confusing system where a lot of things are confidential. And so if you don't have time to develop and understand, what you're getting is like intro 101 stories over and over and over again.
Right.
So this is a good question. Do children in Texas get attorneys?
Yes, they do. Yeah. So states all do it sort of differently. In Texas, kids are entitled to attorneys. It's interesting because I got a couple questions about CASAs, like where was the CASA in this case? And I thought that, you know, part of it is I'm working with records that, I mean, I didn't see that much about the CASA, but the other thing is that, you know, CASAs are volunteer positions, and I think that kind of shows something about what we're valuing. So you're asking volunteers to do a very hard, difficult, and specialized job. And, you know, although Texas does give kids attorneys, in the book, you can see a lot of problems with the way that the courts were run and how the attorneys were appointed.
Here's another question. I was wondering, not I, but the person asking the question, why did you not speak to any transracial, biracial, and Black adopted people, or former foster youth? Were you able to give money to the families for their emotional labor?
Okay, so I did talk to a bunch of transracial adoptees and former foster youth, both for the book itself, but also like in the course of my reporting. I learned a lot from adoptee rights organizations and people like on Twitter. There's a really active adoptee community that really helped me understand it's sort of in a similar way, like they feel that their experience has been invisibilized, but by the way that we write about this stuff. So that was really foundational to me in the way that I approach this story. The money thing, that's a journalism thing. You can't give money, but yeah, you can't give money to your sources because then it's like potentially could be seen as coercive, especially if there were a couple times when I shared a Peach's Cash App, for instance, because she had like a crisis, and I tried to help in ways that were not financial, but that were actually like meaningful. So part of the, I went and got some of the remains of the children and brought them back to their birth families. That was part of the, like, my idea was that like they have given so much to me by like opening up so much to me and trusting me, and this was something that I knew I could do for them because of being in contact with the right people and all of that could be like a meaningful, concrete benefit to them.
What can CPS do as an organization to address this kind of very ingrained, insidious racism, classism of their employees?
That's kind of a hard question because I feel like although it definitely exists, I'm not sure that like all of the sensitivity trainings or whatever are really hitting the mark. I think some sort of like non-defensive awareness. So like with this story, Texas just pretend this never happened. They never like said anything about it. They never did an investigation about it. They just like moved on. And I think that's sort of indicative of how at least the system in Texas operates. It's like no accountability. They don't really comment on anything. I feel like a very first step would be to really honestly engage with the criticism. And I don't know if that's like would happen. You know what I mean?
It will.
My name is Valeria. My question is bouncing off the question you were just asked. So you answered already like what people who want to enter social work and maybe want to enter the system as a teacher employee, what advice you could give them. And then on the other hand, like what advice would you give to people who are thinking about fostering, knowing that this is a broken system?
I think that there's still a real use for foster parents in this current, where we are right now. And I think that particularly LGBTQ or affirming foster parents are badly needed because of the disproportionate amount of LGBTQ foster youth. I think that like the idea of being a temporary safe place for people is is really powerful. I think that there's like a lot of bureaucracy and it's very challenging to do in a way that's not, but I think that, I also think that there's a way in which we can be and provide so much to kids in our communities outside of the system itself. I think a lot about my own childhood and how I had a very rocky home life, but I had several people in like essentially a little village of like my friends' parents and my teachers and other people like that who really stepped in ways that were above and beyond their role to provide that stability for me. So I feel like we have like isolated all of our family structures, right, to being like, you watch your own kid, like you figure it out. And like the idea that we could expand how we care for children that aren't our own children, just generally, I think we could do so much more to watch out for and protect and support kids in our own lives.
Hi, I'm just wondering, how did writing this book and doing all the research change you as a journalist?
That's a good one.
Well, it really changed me as a person and as a journalist. It's hard to like quantify that in words, I feel like. I think it was really challenging work. It was extremely challenging emotionally. I think that I needed to, like it kind of forced me to be more accountable to my own mental health in order to do the job that I wanted to do. Because journalism is often done very stoically, and it's like, like the idea of journalists as like this sort of grizzled, just the facts, kind of like at a remove from what's going on, and I didn't experience this work in that way. And I think there's a lot of ways that traditional journalism, the way that we do it, serves to protect journalists and our own, like, it's harder to do it when you're really fully engaged with it. And I think that I both was like, I think this work allowed me to understand that the kind of journalism that I want to do is more direct or more like transparent, more honest about the reality of it, rather than me being like, with my little notebook and behind the scenes or whatever.
Josie, we had one up in the front here. Oh, there's one over there too. Okay.
I was just going to ask a question on my way.
Okay.
In terms of grassroots movements, would this be a state-by-state issue to tackle? Has there been any forward movement towards abolishment in any area?
What was the first couple words of that?
In terms of grassroots movement, so movement work, not system work, work outside of the system. Would this be a state-by-state issue to tackle? And then the second question is, has there been any forward movement towards abolishment in any area?
Well, I think that we're at the state-by-state question is interesting. I haven't really thought of it that way. I think that it's definitely important to sort of like be involved in the community that you're in. I think it's also like we're sort of at this stage where abolition, particularly of the child welfare system, is like, we were just talking about this earlier, it's really kind of mainstreamed in a way just over the past few years, and that's really exciting. I feel like there are people who are receptive to the message now that maybe wouldn't have been just 5 years ago when I started writing this book. So I think like ultimately it's a mind frame change and that can happen on all levels, right? Like, but it starts at the individual and then it kind of moves on from there, like in concentric circles. I hope I answered that okay.
I'm present with the histories and myths that kind of inform the tragedy. And I'm curious, with that in mind, what you thought of Atlanta's reimagining of and the tragedy that took place. Yeah.
Alan was just asking me about this before we started. I actually haven't seen it. I'm gonna watch it now. At the time when it came out, I was like, I can't watch this. But I got a lot of like, I basically got 1 million people, like everyone I know, was like, hey, and I got the gist. I heard that it did a good job in making the like that it made the racism piece of it very super clear. I think part of why I was so sensitive to it was the narrative of the case in the media has been overall really lacking in systemic analysis, in the racism component, and also like obviously like the birth families were invisibilized from the mainstream narrative. So I think I got so like I just knew that about myself. Like I'm touchy. So just being like so involved with the families. That being said, I'm ready. I think now I'm gonna watch it, and then I can answer that question.
So I work in international foster care, and recently I've just been meeting with a lot of people on the domestic side, going to a lot of events to talk about this, and it's been very fascinating for me because the more that I learn about it, the more different it seems like what we are doing. Because we don't have any affiliation with CPS, and it really does seem like a very broken system. So I have been trying to kind of go to more like politically charged events and just find people that I feel like are really passionate about this and seek them out as foster parents. I'm wondering if you have any advice for me, just any general advice, like where can I go to find good quality foster parents?
That's a good question. I feel like maybe, I don't know. I mean, again, like I sort of, and I'm not sure exactly what you do in the ways that it's different because I feel like I don't know.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'll do a quick full explanation, but basically we are, all of our funding and all of our youth come from the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So we get our referrals from them, and it's first come, first served basis with the entire country. And so we cannot accept any referral unless we already have a family license for them to go to that we think will be a good fit. And so we work really hard to try to find families that are, from like similar countries, if not the same country as our youth, or just feel like, have a similar background, would be a good fit for them, having, the same religion or just anything, that's very closely related. And so, we are very against trying to have the whole like white savior complex. Like we try really hard to have families of color.
Yeah.
And, match them accordingly. And yeah, we have families that have been with us for over a decade that are good success stories, and then we have families that are not so great. But it's just, I found it's very difficult to bring on foster parents for this particular population because they're teenagers, usually boys, and they have a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
And many of them are trafficked here as well, so there's just a lot of pieces to it.
Yeah.
Find people that are willing to take that on.
Yeah, or like equipped, like to handle that, because I think that's a piece that gets, like in the Hart case, they adopted 2 sibling groups, 6 kids, mixed ages, various trauma histories. That's extreme, that's an extreme amount of work, and also you have to be a very well-resourced person, like emotionally and sort of, psychologically and all of that to handle what's like really too much for a lot of people. So it's hard because, you want to find those people, and also that's a tall, so I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry.
And that's okay. For students in here, we do really need tutors as well. If anyone wants to be a volunteer tutor for ESL.
Cool.
Just another lesser way of keeping
I think we are wrapping up.
One more.
One more.
Last question.
Let me scoot over. I am researching the child welfare system in New York City, specifically planning to do interviews with parents who've been impacted by the family policing system, specifically with data and algorithms that they're using to score risk and things like that. And I'm wondering, how did you prepare for the hearing about the lived experiences of these families? Like, you as the researcher, investigator, the journalist, how did you prepare for them reliving this experience? It's something I'm thinking about a lot, of how, I'm researching this very technical case, but they're going to have to retell me, this very traumatic situation. So I'm curious how you approach the conversations and what you maybe did in the moment. What was your guide for how to navigate that?
Yeah, I thought a lot about trauma reporting. Both, I think there's two pieces to that. There's like the best practices that you can do in the moment to be safe, like with the person who's sharing a traumatic thing with you. And I think that involves being really sensitive to what's going on in the moment, like being basically fully focused on them, and active listening, allowing them to sort of talk at their own pace. Like, you have these things that you need to know, right? And how do you get that information without breaking their memory or jumping in and so like it often takes a long time. I felt like a lot of the interviews took a while, and I would clear the whole day. So then the other piece of it is like, how do you take care of yourself when you're hearing about a lot of really traumatic stuff? And I feel like you have to do that piece to do the like witnessing piece well. So yeah, I would clear my day. Like when I'm doing like a traumatic interview, that's like all I'm gonna do. I like give myself a process to like decompress. So however that would look like for you, hot bath, running at the gym, something like that, But I also feel like in the moment, that act of witnessing can be very healing and powerful if you're not barging in there and because there's a way that you can provide healing in this moment, and then there's a way that you could re-traumatize them and hurt them again, and that's not what you ever want to do, right? So it's like, I think part of it is just focusing on them and their cues, and sometimes seeing sort of like allowing their process to be what it is, and then trying to get your checklist, like have your checklist, prep for it, right? So that it can feel natural and you don't feel like you're jumping in when they're on a train of thought. Was that helpful?
Yes. Okay, I think that's the final question. Roxanna, we want to thank you so much for coming out and speaking with us tonight. For those of you who are here in person, Roxanna is gracious enough to sign copies of the book. You should have received a you who are here in person and for those of you who are attending this event virtually, I just want to remind you again, please follow upEND Movement on Twitter and Instagram at upEND Movement. And also visit our website to sign up for our newsletters to learn about more events like this at upendmovement.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Roxanna.
Hold those up.